Presenting today our paper, The Cost of Building Walls, Immigration, and the Fiscal Burden of Aging in Europe. Um, I'm just going to jump right into it. So, what's our concern here? Everyone more or less knows that population aging is a major concern for public finances in advanced economies in general and in Europe in particular. So, we know that, just based on demographic trends that have been going on and will continue to go, um, the old age dependency ratio, which just means the importance of old retired people, let's say, in the population, is increasing and will continue to increase a lot. So 2019 projections from Eurostat say it would rise from 35% to 56% of the population, the share of old retired people, in within 30 years. And this creates what is often called the fiscal burden of aging, meaning that because there is more retired people in comparison to working age people, there's less tax collection and more spending on things like social security or healthcare. Now, immigration from developing countries, which is also, of course, a trend in Europe, can actually help with this, just based on the fact that it's younger and potentially more fertile than the existing population. So it would reduce this aging trend. But at the same time, as we all know and have been discussing a lot in our countries, immigration is currently mostly discussed as a kind of problem. And in fact, there are several political proposals gaining more and more traction, which suggest that we should severely restrict or even eliminate, in the extreme, immigration flows from these countries. Now, maybe a lot of you know, but even I think myself before working on this wasn't fully aware. The fact is that given the current life expectancy and especially fertility rates in Europe and in advanced economies, without immigration, our societies would be on the path to extinction, which sounds a little bit extreme, but it's true in the sense that because fertility is below the replacement rate, so it's below 2.1 children per woman, it means that if there was no immigration, our populations or the total population would be declining, so with negative growth, until eventually disappearing. So populations, or European populations in particular, are sustained by this inflow of migrants, mainly from developing countries, which is kind of exogenous in the sense that it depends more on the conditions in the origin countries and overall in the world. And so it's, kind of more or less stable. And importantly, for what we'll see next, it's kind of invariant to the size of the target population. So it doesn't really depend on whether the native population, let's say, is increasing or decreasing. It's just this kind of exogenous inflow of immigrants coming from developing countries. And what this means, combining these two facts, is that the population share of immigrants and their descendants is inevitably increasing over time in Europe. Okay? Now, as I just mentioned, immigrants are relatively young, which means that not only do they help us avert a decline of total population, but they will also influence its age structure, making it younger. And to make this absolutely clear, let me just show you this chart, which is just comparing the age distribution of the current population in Europe and the age distribution of the immigrant flow coming into Europe. This is 2019 data, but it's still kind of pretty accurate. So the bars show you the age distribution of the current population. So this is what you often see like as population pyramids, but just like flipped to flip 90 degrees. And what you see is that, there's this mass of people here in the late working ages from like 45 to 60, and then declining, of course, as people are dying, and up to then growing. So it's not really a population pyramid because, as if you've looked into demographic stuff, you'd know this big kind of baby boom or cohorts born in the 60s and then initial 70s, where there was a time of very high fertility and left us with this large mass of like middle-aged people currently. Okay. In any case, the trend over time is that this age distribution is getting more and more slanted to the right as our populations are aging. The flow of immigrants from developing countries is completely different. It's mainly composed of pretty young working age people. This is the line that you see here, and there's really this big peak around between the ages of 20 and 30, and then a few kids and a few older people. So just based on that, we know that immigrants, are helping making the European population a little bit younger than it would be. So all this to explain kind of our point here and what we're coming after. In aging societies, like in Europe in particular, migration, and in particular migration from developing countries, is sustaining and rejuvenating the population. What we're going to ask in this paper is, what does this imply for public finances? So these demographic effects. And in particular, we're going to try to understand what would happen if immigration were restricted, as these kind of political proposals suggest, and also in the opposite direction to help us understand what would happen if immigration was stronger. Okay, and so what we're going to do here is we're going to run our own population projections using just kind of standard assumptions and vary the intensity of immigration flows. Now, the reason we do this and we don't just take official population projection, the standard, is to explore a bit more and get some theoretical insights on the properties of these population models and how manipulating immigration will change somehow the results, let's say. And then the second thing, and the main, let's say, part of our work, is that we're going to use microdata from different surveys to estimate the demographic profiles of government spending and revenue. What this means is we're going to see how people with different characteristics, such as age or where they're coming from, pay taxes and receive government benefits or enjoy government spending. And then we combine these two things to assess the population projections and what different scenarios for immigration will imply for public finances. And essentially, this will be kind of an application with this European data of these things we've learned we'll learn from looking at the population models. And this will allow us to quantify to some extent the effects of restricting or potentially increasing immigration on the fiscal burden of aging. This is the plan, let's say. To give you, first idea of what we find here. So as said, we built our own population projections. We study its dynamics. What we do in this model, crucially, and you'll hear this many times, is there is a constant flow of net migration coming in from outside the EU into Europe. And this is not something like that we just made up. It's the same setting and the same assumptions used in every official population projection. What we do then is we take a little bit of an extra step and look at a large set of different scenarios to immigration and study what happens to the model in these different cases. Now, in doing this, we're going to take the age structure, the education level, the fertility rates of the actual immigrant flows coming in from Europe from the data. So it's also not just assumptions. We're going to try and look at what immigration flows look like today and just see what that implies in a projection for the future. Now, of course, we're talking about public finances here. The main goal with this is to have a clear sense of what's the link between immigration and the dependency ratio, because as I'll explain hopefully later a little bit better, this dependency ratio, so the ratio of old and young, so inactive people to the working age population, really is the key statistic, if you want, of the population that links that links the structure of population to public finances. Now, what we find after this is that restricting immigration has positive and increasing effects on the dependency ratio. So reducing immigration worsens the dependency ratio. It reduces the share of working age people to the others. And those effects are not only positive in the sense, but they're increasing. So the more I restrict immigration, the more I will affect the dependency ratio. These effects, of course, if I'm increasing the dependency ratio, are detrimental to public finances, because the higher the dependency ratio, the less working age to inactive people I have, and the worse my fiscal balances would be. And this is what we call, as in the title, the costs of building walls. Now, the mechanism, I won't get into too much detail right now, but this is actually a pretty simple thing. It just has to do with the fact that what we're doing in these projections is like a kind of permanent change to immigration flows this is going to have cumulative effects that build up over time. And given that the situation is a declining population where immigrants are slowly taking over, quote unquote, this is going to build up effects and generate this kind of nonlinearity that I'll get back to later. Okay, but this is just population projections, basically. We then try to be a bit more, quantify this a bit better and what this means for public finance. We estimate these demographic profiles that I talked about before. Specifically, this means we estimate the per capita taxes and benefits for age, gender, education, and region of birth groups. So this to separate basically the native European population and immigrants from outside the EU. We do this for all euro area countries and then put it together. So all the results you'll see are for a kind of euro area average, let's say. This is what we do to what we use then to measure the fiscal burden of aging, which just means we take these demographic profiles from the data, we keep them fixed, and then compute the fiscal deficit today and in the future as implied by our population projections. What we do, this is kind of, then we end up with a bunch of like paths that you'll see in the end. It's a little bit hard to just, take a stance on what it means just from looking at these future paths. So following the literature that does this like public finance analyses, namely this generational accounting tradition, what we do is we come up with a summary measure of the fiscal burden of aging that kind of consolidates all these projected deficits into one number that makes it a little bit easier to compare different situations, namely in our case, to compare situations with different migrations, okay? And I'll define this fiscal burden of aging metric in a little bit. But just to make it clear, then the main kind of exercise will be to look at this fiscal burden of aging metric and see how it changes under different scenarios for net migration from outside the EU. Okay, the main results, let's say, to give you already an idea, is that under the baseline projection, let's say, which is based on keeping fixed the migration currently observed, which in 2019, which is our base year, was 0.4% of the euro area population per year. In this scenario, taxes would need to increase by 12.7% on average to ensure fiscal sustainability. And this is what we call the fiscal burden of aging, okay? Migration relieves this fiscal burden of aging, which means, as we say, that building walls would have high costs. If we were to completely shut down migration, and so there would be zero immigrants coming in, let's say, or net migrants, this fiscal burden of aging would increase by 2.1 percentage points, up to basically 15%, which said this way might not seem like a lot, but what this means is that the additional tax increase necessary to fix, let's say, the fiscal imbalances generated by demographic change, by aging, would be almost 1% of GDP every year. So it's a big kind of impact on these fiscal effects of aging, okay? Now, if reducing migration has this big effect, then you would think, well, but then maybe we can solve this problem by increasing migration. Now, that's true to some extent. Increasing migration can help to reduce these fiscal gaps brought by aging, but there is a kind of diminishing returns idea here, meaning that each additional immigrant, so to speak, will have a smaller effect on the age structure of population and therefore on this fiscal burden of aging. As an example, if we doubled net migration flows, which is already kind of an unrealistic kind of idea, this would reduce the fiscal burden of aging by 1.5 percentage points. So basically, increasing migration by 100% already gives only about 75% of the effect than you get by reducing migration 100%. And this is this non-linearity that I've mentioned before and that will become clear, I hope, in a few slides. The last thing, just in case you're thinking about it, and I'll detail a little bit more, is that boosting fertility, which is kind of the other margin in demographic parameters, let's say, is not really an alternative solution and does worse than migration, let's say, in helping with the fiscal burden of aging. Okay, just to very quickly where this fits in the literature, it's mainly focused in this kind of public finance, public economics literature that has looked at the fiscal effects of immigration into developed economies from developing countries. Basically, there are three kind of different approaches to this. There's fiscal accounting studies, there's more macro-y general equilibrium models looking at this, and more recently, there's a kind of more empirical macro approach looking at time series and trying to estimate these effects based on that. Our study is clearly kind of playing into this first, more traditional, let's say, strand of the literature in this space. Our contribution here is to show this nonlinearity, first of all, between immigration and the fiscal burden of aging, which we were kind of surprised that this hadn't been really highlighted already, because this simple effect that we're talking about is present in every official population projection that deals with immigration scenarios. It's present in any of these studies in this fiscal accounting tradition that I mentioned. It had just not been like clearly pointed out that it's behind the results in our to the best of our knowledge, of course. Then we do just add by doing this kind of careful accounting methodology with different demographic dimensions that really go as much as possible to the actual features of immigration in the data. And then this is more like our policy contribution, let's say, is that by doing this for all European country or Euro area countries, and for the Euro area, we're providing like comparable estimates of this fiscal burden of aging and of the role of immigration in that can be compared across countries, and potentially this could give rise to other questions that we don't explore in this paper. Okay, maybe let me just say that this is how I'm going to structure the rest of the talk. First, I'm just going to explain to you the population projection model that we're using. I'm not going to get at that stage into these more theoretical points about the mechanism. I'm going to leave that for the end. I'm just going to lay out like the assumptions and how the population projections works. Then I'm going to go straight to the different components in how we use to measure the implications of population projections for public finances. So explain just what we do, what's the data, and what's the setting. And then in the main results, I'll bring everything together, showing the key results in the population projection, their implications for the dependency ratio, and therefore for public finances. And at that point, I will discuss a bit more the mechanism and what we think is going on in this kind of projections. And finally, I'll wrap up. Let me take a breather here to check if there's any questions at this point. I don't know, there's something in the chat I can see, but I think there's nothing there. So shall I just go on?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. So the projection model that we're using here obviously doesn't look super attractive just based on this equation, but it's actually pretty simple. It's just the classic, what in demography you call a cohort component model. It's just the standard demographic projection. Each year, the population of a certain age, some of them die based on these mortality rates M, and there's a new cohort born, which is basically the combination of the existing population in the previous period and the group-specific fertility rates of each cell, let's say, of the population. This is combined together and gives rise to a new cohort. The key things here that I highlight is first that this in what we're doing here, this is repeated across genders and country of birth groups, okay? So there's like two, you can think of it as two separate populations that are just living together, one native group composed of EU-born and descendants, and an immigrant group, which is composed of the non-EU-born, so immigrants from the mostly developing countries and their descendants. And these will be kind of two separate groups in the projection. And then the crucial thing is that every year there is this constant flow of new immigrants, let's say, which has its own distribution of age and gender, and that's it basically. I'll get into detail on the next slide, but basically most of the parameters we're taking for this come from Eurostat's like official projection exercise. So the general trends are kind of compatible with the main projections in Europe. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. And so what's like going on behind the scenes here? Mortality rates are varying, not very much, but they are. So life expectancy is increasing a little bit from about 80 years old at birth in the beginning in 2019 to 89 in 2100. And there's no difference between migrants and natives here. So we assume that after people, you know, immigrate and are integrated in European society, let's say, they will have the same life expectancy as everybody else. Fertility rates are also changing somewhat over time. And here there are differences between natives and migrants. So for natives, they're low, of course. They're like, you know, depending on the country, but on average, it's around 1.6, if I'm not mistaken. They are increasing slowly in the projection, but it's really a very slow increase. This comes from the Eurostat assumptions. It's a slow increase, meaning its fertility is always below replacements. Like it will still be, it's like from 1.6 to 1.8 until the end, still far from the 2.1 replacement rate. For migrants, it's quite different. So the fertility in the data, the fertility for migrants from outside the EU is pretty high compared to native EU citizens, let's say. It's around 2.4, if I'm not mistaken. The assumption we take is that this higher fertility of migrants will decline slowly in the projection period and converge to about replacement, so 2.1, by the end of this projection period, so 2100. In any case, this means that there will be a little bit of changes in these fertility and mortality rates going on in the main projections, but nothing that changes the essential features, which are natives have fertility below replacement, migrants have fertility above replacement. Okay. One important thing, sorry, that I forgot to mention here is that while migrants have fertility, this high fertility, their descendants do not. So we assume that the offspring, let's say, of immigrants from outside the EU will not have the same fertility rates as their parents and will just have the same as natives, which is usually the more reasonable assumption in common with other exercises. Okay.
So one question.
Yes.
So
please.
then when immigrants come, they just stay forever, right? Well, until they die.
No,
Yes.
not exactly. Not exactly.
So there's role for return migration then somehow.
So there is to some extent, in the sense that what we do, as said, is we take the age distribution of net migration as in the data, which includes some return migration. Meaning, so we have this, so imagine we have for every age, let's say, a value of net migration, which is immigrants minus emigrants, right? Return migration, meaning so people who currently are in the EU and immigrated in the past and now are returning, is there. So the return migration will be captured to some extent in this sense. Now, of course, this is far from perfect in the sense that we would have to be, you know, completely correct about this. We would have to kind of predict what would be the level of return migration in the future based on current young immigration. But insofar as some of the older age immigration today is return migration, that we capture. Make sense? Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
More or less.
And
okay. We
sorry, I just take the
Yep.
I just take the time to jump in. Maybe I'm anticipating a little bit, but concerning the return migration,
Yeah.
if like it's not 100%, so then the migrants that are coming, they are like paying taxes, etc. So generating a benefit for the state. But then if they stay, they are becoming older and older and older.
Exactly.
And then they will like benefit from the system.
That's
So, like,
entirely correct. That's entirely correct, and it's going to play an important role in the results, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is that clear? The previous question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good. So as said, we're modeling here migration as a constant flow, let's say. Ready explained that we keep, or just to make sure, we keep together as natives, both nationals and migrants between EU countries. So, we don't differentiate. We just consider natives are people in the EU and immigrants are those coming from outside the EU. Just to be clear, this flow is pretty much always positive. So even with this a little bit of return migration at the end, there's most usually still more inflows than outflows in the data, let's say. This I've mentioned already. One point I haven't mentioned yet is that we do take into account the fact that, in particular, immigrants have a different education level on average, let's say, compared to natives. And so what we do is we do have the data on the education level of immigrants and of the immigrant population, and we incorporate that in the projections. Moreover, we do not keep the current, there's no data, the projections, of course, that we could or take off the shelf of how skill or education levels will change over time. We do have the data today. And so what we do, and this is like behind what you'll see going forward, is we take the distribution or so, not the distribution, but the levels of education of the current 25-year-old generations, both native and immigrants. And we assume that this is already like the end point of the increase in education levels, and so that this distribution will apply to every subsequent cohort. So in our projections, the education levels, as you'll see in a couple of slides or one slide, the education levels are increasing over time. Okay, but this is just from the fact that older people today have lower education levels compared to current young people, and we're just taking the assumption that the levels of current young people will remain going forward, and that's what we do. So okay, and so this is what we get, let's say, just for a general picture of what's going on in these population projections. So as said, the working age group of people is declining. So this first graph is just showing the composition of the population by, let's say, old working age and young groups over time. And the main kind of pattern that you see is that this working age group in the middle is getting compressed as time goes by. What happens here is that the dependency ratio goes from about 0.9, so there's a little bit more working age people than the others. Sorry, the opposite. The dependency ratio is young and old divided by working age. And this from 0.9 in the beginning of the projection goes to around 1.1 by 2100, which means by the end of this period, there will be more young and old people than working age people. And this is kind of common to any standard projection these days, let's say, for advanced countries. In terms of education, this effect that I was talking about, you see here. So this is basically primary, secondary, and higher education people. You see that the share of higher education ends up increasing a little bit from just over 25 to close to 30 to close to 40% of the population. But this is just as old people are driven out and are taken over by these younger generations who have the current, let's say, distribution of education. Now, the more crucial part to look at for our question here is what's going on in terms of the origin composition of the population. So from the beginning, where we have around 10% in 2019 of the population composed of immigrants from outside the EU, this share is growing quite quickly over the projection, and it reaches around 50% by 2100. So this means that by 2100, half of the population is either non-EU immigrants, current and new ones, or their descendants, which is, and the descendants at that point are about half of this 50%.
Can I ask a quick question?
Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we need to consider any distinctions between types of immigrants, like if they're refugees or asylum seekers versus economic migrants. And when you're thinking about like the costs of building walls and restricting immigration, are you thinking about like different employment restrictions, or are you assuming that all immigrants are able to work?
I'm assuming I'm just taking it from the data. So you'll see next what we're doing is we're simply take the taxes and benefits paid by different groups of the population, including immigrants, and we differentiate between immigrants and nationals. So I just take as given what the current immigrant groups are doing in terms of working, let's say. So if insofar as that doesn't change, so what going to your question, insofar as this distinction between immigrants who are economic migrants and others were to remain constant, it wouldn't really affect much our results, we believe. Of course, it might, and there I can't really speak to that because the approach here is just to look at the features of immigrants today in the data in terms of how much they work and what they pay in taxes and what they receive in benefits, and assume that's going to remain fixed going forward. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So I think, I have about 10, 11 minutes, right? Or, okay,
You have 10 minutes.
right.
A bit less than 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I am just going to skip a little bit quickly over this part. All I want to say is kind of ignore the equation for me right now. All I want to say here is that what we do, as said, is we hold fixed these demographic profiles by different groups, by age and also by immigrant groups, which say basically how much on average does a person, member of each group, of each age group or country of origin group, pays or receives in a tax or benefit. And this combined with the population projections will give me kind of the net contribution to the budget of different groups over time. Then to make things a little bit easier to digest, we, as said, forget the equation here. We condense all this information, so all these projected taxes and benefits, and we look at what would be the permanent tax increase necessary to ensure government solvency, so to ensure that the public debt is sustainable. And I'll refer to this as either the rebalancing tax increase or simply the fiscal burden of aging. This permanent tax increase necessary to ensure government solvency, given that taxes are declining and expenses are increasing because of aging. And this is the fiscal burden of aging that we'll talk about. Okay, so we use a bunch of microsurvey data. I'll skip that just so that we're all on the same page. When we combine this microdata and look at the age profiles of revenue and spending, it's just what you'd usually expect, meaning revenues are very concentrated in the working ages, basically because of taxes and contributions related to labor. And spending is the opposite because young people involve education spending, and old people have higher healthcare spending and receive pensions, basically. And so this is why, if the dependency ratio increases, public finances get worse. Okay, let me skip this and jump right into our main results. Okay, so as said in the baseline, so with 0.4% of immigration per year, this tax increase necessary to ensure fiscal sustainability is 12.7% on average for the euro area. And this essentially comes from the fact that as the old age group is increasing a lot, like we showed before, the deficit that group implies is getting larger, while the contribution of the working age people remains more or less the same. And also, by the way, the negative contribution of children is kind of more or less constant over this period. So it's really about this old age group increasing, and there's less, and there being relatively less working age people to pay for that. In terms of when you look at this from the country of birth perspective, it's pretty interesting, even politically, to see what's going on in the first few years, because what you have is that the non-EU immigrants are currently so young, let's say, that their contribution is actually to the budget is positive right now. So it's kind of reducing the deficit in the euro area. But then over time, with the projection, this starts to decline. And then by the end of the projection, all, regardless of country of birth, both natives and immigrants have this negative budget. Why? This goes back to the question before. Non-EU immigrants come in as young, but they also age over time. And then later in life, they will also have a negative contribution because they also receive pensions and other benefits. They also have kids who also need education and healthcare. And this kind of is, so in the end, they're kind of, everyone is aging, let's say, and contributing to the fiscal burden of aging. Okay, so now the main point is to use this framework to look at the effects of changing immigration flows on demographic dynamics and through that on public finances. To recall, the baseline is 0.4% of total population every year of young, relatively unskilled migration. We look at different scenarios between 0%, where we completely shut down migration, and 2% of total population, which is already very unrealistic because it means that we would increase by 5%, by a factor of 5, the scale of immigration. And keep in mind that in all these scenarios, it's really only the scale of immigration flows that's changing. The age and skill distribution of immigrants is fixed. This is the result, let's say. So currently, these 12.7% are here. So at 0.4% of immigration, you have a 12% fiscal burden of aging. If you shut down migration, this goes up to basically 15%. And if you increase by 100% immigration, you get to those minus or 1.5 percentage points, which is about here. Notice the nonlinearity. So as we reduce migration, this kind of has increasing costs for public finances. As you increase immigration, this helps. So the slope is negative here, let's say, but with diminishing returns. And this also implies basically that you cannot solve the problem just with immigration because you'll eventually reach the point where this, where there's no gains from that. And in any case, as said, boosting immigration to more than 1% of the population per year would already be unrealistic. So this is kind of the realistic region of values that you could take here. Okay. 2 more slides and then I'll wrap up. This is to try to, in the 5 minutes, I guess, that I have left, explain a little bit the mechanism. First, focus on the graph in the middle. The graph in the middle is showing how the dependency ratio is increasing in the projection, okay, for different scenarios of migration, where the black line is the baseline at 0.4% or 0.4-ish% of immigration, and then the darker lines above are less migration, and the lighter lines are more migration, okay? So the dependency ratio is rising, okay? There's less working age people relative to the others. If I reduce migration, this trend accelerates, and actually with each addition cut to migration, the difference is widening. So if I shut down migration completely, the dependency ratio by the end of the projection is much higher. And in the opposite direction, if I increase migration, I get less and less pull on this dependency ratio. Now, as we know, but from what I was saying before, the dependency ratio basically drives directly deficits in this kind of projection, even with all the bells and whistles that we have, education, different contributions from migrants and natives, all of this, it's still all about the dependency ratio drives the deficit and therefore the fiscal burden of aging. Now, why is there this kind of asymmetry? Well, look here. In the right panel, you see I'm plotting the increase in the share of non-EU immigrants in the total population. So the black line is showing the same thing I showed in the bar chart before, where the share of immigrants goes from 10% to around 50% by the end, okay? As I reduce migration, the effects of this are larger because I'm reducing not only immigrants in the first year, but every year, okay? So as I kind of pull this down all the way to 0, I'm only left with the current immigrants, okay? And so this is flat here, and eventually in the very distant future, the population would also disappear anyway, okay, without new immigrants coming in, let's say. In the opposite direction, as I increase the size of the immigration flow, the share of immigrants in the population will grow even faster, but there's a limit to this because at the end of the day, this share is topped by one. I have this native population. I'm putting in more and more immigrants every year, but the other kind of the natives won't disappear, right? So all I can do at most is get this as faster as possible to one, but there's a limit to that, okay? And this combination between the non-EU the immigrant population and the native population, and the fact that when I increase the immigration flow, I can only do so much to push the total population more towards immigrants is limited, okay? And therefore, my pull on the dependency ratio will be limited to that, because this is about getting the dependency ratio closer to the immigrant dependency ratio and farther from the native dependency ratio, which is a population that's kind of going to zero. And this is what explains the nonlinearity in the fiscal effects that I was talking about before. Okay, so I had a little bit too much slides for my time. I'll just wrap up in 30 seconds to say we looked in this paper at the implications for public finance of this role of migration and demographic dynamics in Europe, and in particular looking at the possible effects of restrictions to immigration on public finances. We showed that migration relieves the fiscal burden of aging in Europe. Without migration, you'd have an additional tax increase necessary of almost 1% of GDP every year to fix the fiscal burden of aging. Building walls would have high costs for public finances. Okay, I hope, yeah, just 1 minute above. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to this discussion of Jasper. Thank you for going through our paper, and to any other comments you guys might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation, Luis. I think that we can jump directly to the comments of Jasper. If you want to share your screen, I think that you can. Okay, perfect.
Okay, here we go. Yes.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thanks for having me to discuss this excellent paper. My first time discussing. What I realized one of the benefits of being a discussant is that you don't have to be very humble about the paper's contribution and so on. You can just go for it. On that, I only have to be humble about my comments about the paper and my understanding of the paper. But the first thing I kind of wanted to start off with is that I think this is a really big policy issue. And as Luis also did mention, like it is also relevant for research itself to have being able to compare the tax burden of aging between countries and so on. So that's also a contribution, but I think it's really big from a policy perspective. And it's not just about the euro area. I understand that a paper has to be narrowly focused and humble, but if we compare this to other countries, how the dependency ratio is projected to evolve in the future, there are cases that are even worse than the EU. So this is data from the OECD. I've also included the youth in the dependency ratio, but it's like a very similar story to the figures that Luis showed. But if we look at Korea, a place I actually was an exchange student in Korea, so I kind of seen the immigration situation in Korea and yeah, what goes on there. I've been trying to follow it ever since. And we have this really crazy projected increase in dependency ratio, like being a very young country at the moment, and it's just gonna, yeah, it's just a dramatic future or change in this dependency ratio for Korea. We also have it for Japan, which is already a lot older compared to the EU, which we have here in the middle, which is also a severe situation. But it's like other countries or other parts of the world can also learn from this work and try to should also be thinking about these questions. Okay, so to summarize the paper, I think the question is, given the behavior of fiscal spending for different groups, and given some population projections, how does changes in immigration affect how much we have to increase the tax burden to balance the intertemporal budget, government's budget constraints. Okay, so this is not the way Luís put it, but just me trying to summarize what this paper is really about. So the how is both a quantitative question, like how many percent do we need to increase the tax burden, but also the functional form of this, the nonlinearity that Luís discussed. And the way to go about this, to answer this question, is to really go to the data and think carefully about how to construct projections of different subpopulations. So that's by age, by gender, skill, and country of birth. And look how will these two grow over time, impute their contributions to taxes, but also how much fiscal spending they are receiving, so disbursements. And then compute the tax burden that needs to change to balance this constraint. And the answer is that if we stick with the flows of 2019, the tax burden has to increase quite a lot by 12.17%. Doubling migration helps a lot, or helps somewhat. It's a quantity question. But the tax burden still has to rise by 11.2%. That's lower, however. If we completely shut down migration, tax burden increases even more by 14.8%. So some of the contributions or unique aspects of this paper is that compared to my understanding of the literature on this, is that the authors of this paper really think carefully about the heterogeneity in the populations or in the subpopulations that they're studying. And that seems to be important in predicting how big the tax burden has to be for the government budget, because my understanding is that it's significantly lower than other projections, and where this heterogeneity is not being taken as seriously. An exercise in the paper that I really liked was that not only do they look for the aggregate euro area, but they also look for individual countries. So it varies a lot across countries how much the tax burden has to rise to balance the budget. And since the euro area is like the currency union, but it's not a fiscal union. So each country should be able to adjust their taxes. So that's very heterogeneous. And some countries don't have to adjust at all. Some countries have to adjust a lot more. I'm gonna get back to that, but that's something I think could be more very interesting to try to understand better why it varies so much across countries. I think also a theoretical contribution here is this finding that the effect is non-linear. So if you increase migration by 1 unit, that does produce a smaller change in the tax burden implied than a 1 unit decrease when we talk about magnitudes, which also needs to be considered. So for example, like if you go back to actually this figure here, look at Korea, very low immigration to Korea, very low immigration to Japan. This nonlinearity implies that just raising immigration a little bit in these countries could have a much bigger effect on the implied tax burden moving forward than it would have for the euro area. So I think this is also like something that policy can learn and try to internalize. So some of my comments on this paper, I've been really trying to, I mean, I like the paper. It's a lot of work to look at a paper that you like and try to find something to try to be constructive about. Okay, but something I thought that I would like to see a discussion about is this a lower bound for the tax burden we're seeing here? Okay, so we're assuming that the behavior is unaffected by changes in the economic environment or by changes to policy or to taxes. But we could imagine that if we start raising taxes, that will turn into a less incentive to people to migrate to the country, or for people in the natives already in the country or immigrants to work. So there are these feedbacks of raising taxes. The environment could also change in origin, which could lower the incentive to migrate. And we did talk about this during the presentation, or Luís talked about the assumption about the skill distribution, and which implies something about educational choices, which all could be changing due to fiddling around with taxes. And this makes me wonder, is that this big rise we already see, is that the lower bound that we could hope for? Is this a best case scenario? Like in practice, they might have to rise even more to offset the feedback effects due to the initial raise in taxes. It's still that I really like the exercise, and it's an important number we're seeing, but just to help policymakers and to interpret this, it would be nice to have a discussion about, is this the lower bound, or do we think there are things that might overestimate this number? Then let me see, what did I put the title for here? I have so many things on the screen here. Yes, okay. A technical question that I really like to hear Luís' thoughts about after is an I don't think we had time to see this in as much in the paper, but increasing fertility did not help to reduce the tax burden in the future. But the idea is that, okay, we have more children in the short run, that produces more workers in the long run that can help alleviate the tax burden. But in the experiment in the paper, raising fertility actually raises the tax burden, which implies that children are just too costly. Children are expensive when they're young, then they turn into working adults, and then they will going to be costly in the future. And I wonder, why is this? Is it that we're just spending too much on education? Because it does itch a bit that children could be, or having kids would be too costly. And it has some consequences for the interpretation of results that, well, if on net, a person born in a country raises the tax burden on nets, then we should just not have any kids. And that's that's just interpretation of that result. But also, since immigrants are more fertile by assumption, if the cost of their descendants is then that every descendant they have will raise the tax burden, that offsets benefits of immigration. So I would really want to understand why it is that children, or having children, raises total tax burden, because that has consequences for like the whole analysis. But it could also indicate that fiscal spending is just too high in 2019 or 2020, kind of the benchmark here that we're using, that we're just on this unsustainable path, no matter what, we have immigration or not, like in no cities, on no path moving forward, can we spend so much relative to the resources we have? Which kind of leads into the third question, or my third comment, is that this paper is about demographics, but there's this whole fiscal side to think about on this issue. If we look at the US, I was just reading, like, it's just so much in the news that I read about how the deficit is huge, but social security system is not sustainable. Like, we will run out of money in the social security system, and by 2030, retirees will have to will have less access to social security moving forward. And there is a discussion in the paper about the timing of boomers entering retirement at the same time as raising fertility would add more children to the economy, which increase deficit of the euro area. It's discussed at page 21, just for Luís to look at if he hears exactly what I'm referring to. So my question then is, does it matter the timing of deficits? Because if it matters that boomers are entering retirement at the same time as we're trying to have more kids to replace them in the future, is there some way to smooth the these deficits. It doesn't matter if it's front-loaded, if it's back-loaded, or if it's uniformly distributed. And it kind of creates a whole other side of the paper to think about how the evolution of the deficits affects the total cost for the tax burden. Yeah, so those are some of my comments, things that I would really want to hear Luís' thoughts about. But to summarize, I think it's a very well executed paper. Okay, it's really detail oriented, and it really takes a serious stab at this big important question. So it is important to take its heterogeneity very seriously. So it really comes to getting all those small details right, as to the best of our ability, to answer this question as well as possible. And it was really fun to read this paper. And really, yeah, it feels like it's very close to just submit it somewhere, even without addressing my comments. But hopefully it could be helpful to you guys. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So Luís, I know there were a lot of points, but maybe in the last minute or so, you can choose one point you'd want to respond to. And if anyone else in attendance has any questions, please put them in the chat and I can also unmute you. Otherwise we can wrap up afterwards.
Yeah, so there was so thank you, Jasper, for the careful reading and great comments. It is obviously still very useful, even though we are close to trying to wrap this up. It is still pretty useful, even if just with the writing. I think you made quite a few points. Maybe I'll go to that one, because I think you said something really interesting, which is how these the heterogeneity across countries that we observe is particularly important in the context of the euro area, because it's not really a fiscal union. So these different adjustment costs, countries will have to somehow fix them on their own, let's say. And so this has kind of important implications, even when you think about the design of a possible fiscal union, given that demographics are so different across countries, then that's probably something people should have in mind. And I think that's a really cool take that I don't think we had thought about before, because we were kind of putting in there to be completely transparent. We have these results. I mean, we made all these projections and we thought, okay, let's put them in there because it might be interesting to someone. But I think that's a cool take that we can use to try to sell this as something more interesting. Of course, we can't. We thought about it a little bit, but then the paper is already quite complete. There's a lot of stuff in there as it is. We thought about this question of trying to unpack why there's so much differences across countries, but it is hard just in our framework to do it, because it's kind of, you can't really very well separate what's the current fiscal stance from the current demographics from the future demographics. So it's hard. It's probably an interesting question for future work, but it's not something we could do much about. I can then I'll can maybe write you afterwards or something with feedback to the other comments. But I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.